Hey guys, in this video I'm going to show you how I edited this photo of car trails in Hong Kong. This is the before image here, and we'll take it to this final image in post-processing and in Photoshop. Just to give you a little bit of background, if you haven't already, please check out the article I recently wrote for tech360.tv. In that article I talk about the shooting process behind this photo in much more detail. But just to go over it really quickly, I'll let you know what I've done briefly. Basically, I took one base photo during blue hour. I shot a set of brackets. Basically, the reason I did this was to capture the blue sky. And then later, once it got darker, it was easier to increase the shutter speed and get longer exposures for the car trails. I actually used 7 separate layers of the car trails to blend into this photo later. So just to confirm, this is a composite image, which basically means that I've used multiple photos to create one final image. I used one photo for the base and 7 layers for the car trails. So let's get to it. I'll show you exactly what I did. So here is my original edit. We took it from this base raw. We blended in some highlights, very minor things to this part, but then I'll show you how you can just basically seamlessly drop in your car trails like this. We've done some minor cleanup as well before making some final adjustments to color and contrast. So let's get to it. Here is my desktop. In this folder I've got the images that I want to use for this edit. So I can click on the top one, hold down Shift and click on the bottom, and I'm going to bring these first into Lightroom. Usually I make my base adjustments in Lightroom. So I can choose Open With, Other, and I'm using Adobe Lightroom Classic. So I'll just double click on that. Alright, so while this is loading, one thing that I tend to do a lot is to color code my photos. When I originally brought these photos into Lightroom, I had a lot more than are here. I probably had about 100 separate photos combined between the sets of brackets that I took as well as the car trails. The first thing I did was to go through and color code the ones that I wanted. For the sake of this video, I've already removed the ones that I'm not using, but basically what you can do, I've got these first 3. If I double click on the first and we go to the develop module where you can edit your photos. Let's see, click on this first one. So this is basically what a set of brackets look like. Here I have a dark exposure, which is 2 stops underexposed. Next I have the same photo but a brighter exposure, which is 1 stop underexposed. And finally the neutral exposure, which has an exposure composition of 0. Usually this is the one that I use in the edit, but it's nice to have the darker images to tone down some of the lights. Sometimes in these cityscape situations where you're shooting at night, you have parts of the photo that are very dark and other parts that are extremely light. So it's good to be able to tone down the really bright highlights later on. So after those, first let's color code those with green just to follow best practices. After that, I shot car trails once it got dark. I think I shot most of these, you can see here, with an exposure time of 15 seconds. If I scroll through, yeah, most of them are 15 seconds, a few of them are 10 seconds. But either way, once you get up to 10 seconds and more than that, then you're starting to capture much longer car trails. So the reason that I took so many versions of these car trails is because it's very difficult to time all the different lanes of traffic in this photo. So what I tried to do is prioritize one lane at a time. I would try to take the left lane, and then maybe I would go for the center lane, and then finally I would go for the right lane. Sometimes you get lucky and you get 2 of the lanes, but it was really, really difficult to capture car trails in all 3 lanes at the same time. Using some Photoshop tricks that I'll show you later, I'll show you how you can basically superimpose all the car trails onto your base image. So with that said, let's start to edit this photo. So I'm going to start with this one here, which is my neutral exposure, which means that it has an exposure composition of 0. This is what the camera considers to be correctly exposed. So right off the bat, I think you can check the histogram here. On this side of the histogram, we have our dark parts of the photo, or shadows, and on this side we have our highlights. You can see that some parts are clipping on this end, and some parts are clipping on this end. On this side, that means the values are completely black. On this side, they're completely white. Generally, we want to avoid this, but since we have more on this side, I'm going to increase my exposure by a bit. Maybe up to, let's see, around 0.4. You can also just type that in, 0.4. Now I see that some of these highlights are way too intense, so I can take my highlights and start to drag them down a bit. Somewhere around -50 maybe. I'll just type that in as well. Then I can start to drag up my shadows to eliminate some of these parts that are touching on the left side of the histogram. Somewhere also around 50, maybe I'll do +40. So this is usually the first thing that I do when I'm editing a photo. I change these three things: the exposure, the highlights, and the shadows. Right now I think the photo, especially down in this bottom portion, looks a bit too orange, so I can change the temperature as well. Maybe I'll change this to 3800. You can see on this side we're getting cooler, on this side we're getting warmer. Somewhere around there looks pretty good though. Let's see what's next. I might boost the contrast a little bit. Generally, when you're starting out with this stuff, you want to be pretty cautious when it comes to moving these sliders around. One beginner mistake is to go a little bit crazy, and then you start kind of, I don't know, you make your photo look a little bit wonky. I'm going to increase the dehaze a bit as well. During the time I was in Hong Kong, it was quite cloudy, and sometimes you get a bit of haze in front of buildings. This is something that was introduced to Lightroom relatively recently, a few years ago I think, and it will kind of cut through some of that haze. So you can see if I go crazy on this, we're really pulling out the detail, but that's a little too much. So I'll just leave this around 8 to 10 or something like that. I'm not going to touch vibrance or saturation quite yet. We can scroll through these other options. By default, the sharpening is at 40, and I like to leave that. And I'll also add a little bit of noise reduction, maybe just 10. That will cut out some of the noise in the sky. We can check these boxes as well, but I'm going to leave them unchecked for now. And I think that's pretty much it. That doesn't take very long, and this is my base edit. So what I'm going to do is right-click this photo. I can go to Export, and now I'm going to bring it into Photoshop. I usually like to drop these in a temporary folder where I keep all my Photoshop edits, but for the sake of this video, I'm just going to leave it on the desktop. You can choose to rename it. I'll just call it Hong Kong Trails. In this section, you want to make sure you're choosing PSD, which means Photoshop format. This here is the color space. For this video, I'm using ProPhoto RGB, and if you're editing this and you want all the resolution intact, then you want to choose a bit depth of 16 bits rather than 8. If you're just doing this for fun, maybe you do 8 because the computer won't lag too much. I'll leave all this the same, and the last thing I want to do is make sure that I'm opening this in Adobe Photoshop 2020, or whatever your version is. So I'll choose Export, and up here in the corner you can see that it's exporting. Sometimes it takes a little bit of time, but it should open Photoshop automatically for us. So we'll just give that a minute before we start to work on the car trail layers. Or we'll give that a few minutes. In the meantime, oh, here we go. All right. In Photoshop now, we've got this base image. So the first thing I'm going to do is click on this lock, which will let me make adjustments to the layer. If I double click here, I can call this maybe Lightroom Adjustments. So if you haven't worked in Photoshop before, it can seem a little bit intimidating at first, but hopefully during this video you get to see a bit of my workflow, and we'll take it step by step throughout the process, and it should be fairly easy to follow along. So the goal is that you are able to edit similar photos by the end of watching this video. So we've got this base layer here. Let's click back into Lightroom and we'll start working on the other photos. So we've got all of these different versions of car trails. If I scroll through, maybe I want to choose one to use as my base. So I'll be looking for one where a lot of the trails are filled in. This one looks pretty nice. You see we've got a little bit in each one of the lanes of traffic. This one as well is pretty good. But let's choose this one here. Maybe I can color code this by right-clicking, set color label, and I'll do this one as yellow or something like that, just to know that this is my base for the car trails. So in this photo here, I'm not really concerned with the top part of this image because that's what I'm going to use this other one for. At this point, I just want to blend in this bottom portion. So I do need to get it to match up so that the tones are fairly similar. So the first thing I'm going to do is increase the exposure a bit, maybe to plus 0.5 to start. I'm definitely going to bring up the shadows. If I click back over here, I can compare this area to this area to see if it matches. This one's a bit brighter, so I'll make this one a bit brighter as well. I can drag up the exposure a little bit more. Somewhere around there should probably be pretty good. I'm also going to change this, cool this down a little bit. So maybe somewhere around 3600. This is the Kelvin temperature. You can change this in camera as well, but then it's nice to be able to make tweaks when you're editing the photo. Might see what some of these other sliders do. Maybe contrast plus 10. And one final thing that I'm going to do to make these trails stand out a bit more, I'm going to bring up the whites. So the whites are like the extreme highlights on this side. You can see if I highlight this part of the histogram that the whites are lit up here. So I'll drag this up a little bit. If I undo, Control Z, you can see that that's bringing it out a little bit. And I kind of like that. So let's put the whites at plus 30. Might drag the shadows back a little. So I think that's pretty good. So I don't need to go too crazy here. I'm going to export this into Photoshop as well. So I'll right-click, Export, and I'll choose Export again. We'll look at an easier way to do this in the future. This one I'm going to include in my base file, which is already called HK Trails. So for the purpose of this, I'm not going to rename it. Alright, so since this was shot on a tripod, these two images should line up seamlessly. To check that out, let's first get this into the other image. So one of the things that's really nice in Photoshop is to remember a lot of the hotkey combinations. So I'll introduce some of them during this video. If you're using Mac, the first thing you want to do is hit Command A to select this entire file. If you're on Windows, it will be Control A. Then we'll hit Command or Control C, Command or Control W to close it, and then finally Command or Control V to drop it on top, to paste it. And we'll call this Car Trails 1 or Car Trails Base or something like that. If I turn this off and on, you can see that these images line up pixel for pixel. So the first thing I'm going to do is put a mask on this. This might be new to a lot of people, especially if you haven't worked in Photoshop before, but basically a mask allows you to include certain parts of the photo and exclude other parts. If I take my paintbrush tool over here, and you can see I have the color black chosen, and I have the mask selected as well, so if I paint this, everything becomes invisible and we can only see this base layer again. So basically, when you have black on a mask, it hides this current layer. And when you have white on a mask, it shows it. So if I take my brush right here, you can hit B on the keyboard to select that. I'll make it bigger by using the bracket keys. Right bracket key to make it bigger, left bracket to make it smaller. I can choose a brush, just ignore this for now. and I will change my color to white. You can also hit X on the keyboard. So if I start painting on this mask, make sure you have the mask selected, it will look something like this. So the white parts are showing this top layer, and the black parts are showing this bottom layer. So let's get rid of that for now. I'll just right click and hit delete mask. And what I'm going to do now is select my gradient tool. And I want my gradient to go from black, so up here will be black on the mask, and down here will be white on the mask. I'll add another mask here, and I think I'll start somewhere around here. If I hold down the shift key, it will make sure that I'm drawing in a straight line. So something like this. You can always try this again if it doesn't work. That's actually the opposite of what I want. I want this top part black and the bottom part white. So one thing I can do is click on the mask and hit Command on Mac or Control on Windows, I. And that will invert it. So you can see now the top is black, the bottom is white. So if I turn this off and on, I think that's doing a pretty good job overall of blending this image together. So now I've got the car trails on the bottom and I've got the base blue hour on the top. If you want to make tweaks to this, you can take your brush tool, B on the keyboard, and start painting back the areas that you want. But you'll want to do this, up here is my brush, you'll want to do this not with 100% hardness. You'll want to make hardness probably 0. That will make this transition much smoother. Okay, so that's pretty good for now. So let's go back into Lightroom. So we've got these 6 other versions of car trails that we haven't yet used, but basically we want to edit all of them exactly the same. So I can copy all the settings that I used to edit this first photo. To do that, I'll right click on the photo we've already edited. I'll go to Develop Settings, Copy Settings, and for now I'll just leave everything checked. Then I will click on this first one that I have not yet edited. I'll click on all these other ones while holding down Command or Control on Windows. Then I can right click and I'll be applying these changes to all of these car trail photos. I can go to Paste Settings. You can see that that will bring them back a bit. Now this is probably going to take a while, and let's hope it doesn't crash my computer, but I'll export all 6 of these to Photoshop at the same time. So actually this time let's look at something different. Instead of exporting and choosing export again, we can just choose export with previous. This will export with the settings that we used last time. So exporting 6 files up here in the corner. We'll see how long this takes. Maybe we'll speed it up if it takes forever. Okay, so at this point all of the photos are starting to come in here. We're going to eventually bring them all into our original file again. Sometimes it might be a bad idea to bring in so many files at the same time, but it seems like it worked. So let's click on the first one. Basically, I'm going to use the same hotkey combination that I used last time. So that would be Command on Mac and Control on Windows. So Command A. I'm just going to use the Mac controls from now on since that's what I'm using. But just keep in mind that every time I say Command, that will mean Control if you're on Windows. So Command A, Command C to copy, Command W to close, and then I'm going to click on my file here that we've been using, click on the top layer, and I'll hit Command V to paste it on top. For now I'm just going to turn this layer off. I'll do the same thing with all of these. Command A, Command C, Command V, paste it on top, turn it off. Next one. Turn it off. And the last one here, Command A, Command C, Command V, And this one I kind of like the trails on this side, so I'm gonna drop this on top of here. So Command V to paste. You can rename all of these, they're all just different layers of car trails basically. So right now, oops, turn this one off. You can see that I have this one. Basically what I want to do is eliminate everything up here and just keep the trails. Even in the foreground, I don't want any of this because in some areas it's adding light that I don't want. So what I can do, one of the things that's really interesting about Photoshop, especially when editing lights and car trails and things like this, is blending modes. So right now I've got the normal blending mode selected. If I scroll through these, you can see that they start to do different things. Some of them look pretty crazy, but these ones in here tend to work really nice. Basically what they'll do is eliminate everything in your photo that isn't light. So the one that will work best in this situation is most likely going to be the first one, lighten. This is what I use probably 80% of the time when I'm doing this kind of thing. So let's choose lighten and see what it's done. Basically, this is just superimposing these trails while not including too much else. But you can see that it is adding the lights in other areas as well. Some of them are really, really bright, and we don't exactly want that. Up here, I think the building is now too bright. So what I'm going to do is add a mask again, and we'll pretty much do the same thing we did last time, but let's use the brush tool this time. So if I click over here, or again hit B on the keyboard, I can choose a black color. So hit X on the keyboard to switch to black. If you ever need to reset these two colors, you can hit D and they'll reset to white and black. So I've got my brush, and with this mask selected, I'm going to just start painting out the areas that I don't want to include. Oops, I need to make sure my opacity is at 100% and also my flow at 100%, and definitely keep your hardness around 0. So I'll start painting this out. That's pretty good. If you want to see, use quick mask mode, which basically shows you where you're painting. You can hit the backslash key on the keyboard, and again to make it go away. So now I'll just do this really fast, and I'll paint out all of this area. So that's pretty good. We'll hit the backslash to get out of that again, and if we turn this off and on, now we're pretty much just including the trails. We've got a little bit of the cars on this side, so I can go back to my black brush, and if I want to get rid of that, we'll see if it helps. I could turn this area off. Maybe I just think that's a bit distracting and I want to get rid of it. So let's go with that for now. Now we'll go to the next layer and do something really similar. So we'll turn this on, change our blending mode to lighten, and if we turn this off and on, ooh, this one's looking a little not so good. Seems way too bright, so I'm just actually going to delete this layer. I don't like it. We'll go to this next one, turn it on. Let's see, I feel like I'm having an issue with some of these. Some of them are darker than the others. So, let's see what I want to do here. This one is pretty light, so I actually need to make a change to that, but that's a good time to teach you what I can do. So let's select this layer and go up to Filter to Camera Raw Filter. Basically, Adobe Camera Raw Filter is the same thing as Lightroom, but it exists within Photoshop. So you're able to make all the same adjustments that we made before, but this time it's just in a different module. So if we go to here, we can drag this around. Basically, we want to make this whole thing a bit darker. This whole bottom section is pretty intense. So I'll just drag down the exposure a bit. It seems pretty good. Maybe I'll increase the whites. This file itself isn't that amazing anyway. The lights don't look too good. There's really only a few trails in this one lane, so we probably don't need this image, but it doesn't matter. Let's decrease this temperature a little bit, just to make it a bit more blue, and we'll hit OK. So nothing major. So now if we change this to lighten, I think that looks a lot better. It looks much more seamless. So I actually only want to include this one single lane of traffic here. Let's see, is it adding anything in this lane? No, it's adding a little bit on this side. Yes, but I don't really like the way those ones look. So let's do something different. This time we can add a black mask. To do that, you can hold down the Option key if you're using Mac, or the Alt key if you're using Windows, and click on the mask button. That will create a black mask rather than a white mask. And now if we hit the brush, we can change our color to white, and we can basically just paint in this lane of traffic, the one that we like. To check the before and after without the mask, then we can hold down Shift and click the mask. That's what it looks like if there's no mask, and this is with the mask. So just turning that off and on, it looks kind of nice. Let's go to the next one. Turn that on. This one is also way too bright. I think some of the adjustments I made earlier must not have copied. So let's go back to Camera Raw, just really quickly. And I'll decrease the exposure again. I think I did -0.75 last time. Even more because I'm trying to get this trail perfect. And it's a little too intense for me. I'll just put it at one stop underexposed, -1. And then I'll pull up the whites a little bit. Another thing I can do here, let's not do that. I can try to adjust the contrast. That might pull them out a little bit more. Or another option is the clarity. That kind of pops them a bit. So I'll just add +8 on that and hit OK. That's much better. I'll change the blending mode to lighten. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to again add a black mask, hold down Option or Alt. There we go, change to my brush, and I'll just paint in this lane. And I think that looks pretty good. Anything else? If I hold down Shift, turn this off and on, you can see the other areas. It looks like I'm missing one over here. And I can also extend this one. So I'll just paint this little area in at the bottom. Good enough. Let's go to the next layer. So I'll turn this one on. This looks much better actually. So I'll turn this on and change the blending mode again to lighten. We can now turn it off and on and we'll see only the car trails. So let's start with a black mask, and just like before, we'll start painting in these areas that we want. We want this. And let's try this last lane as well. I don't think that... Sorry? Okay. It's okay? Yeah. Should I clap again? Yeah. Alright, so let's go on to the last layer of car trails. We'll turn this on, change the blending mode again to lighten. And at this point I think we already have enough trails, so let's not even use this layer. I'll just click on this and hit delete or backspace if you're using Windows. So we've got all these different layers of car trails. If we look down here, you can see the file size is 1.5 gigs, which is really big. And we're not using a lot of these images. You can see in this one here, we're only using this tiny area that's white. So one thing that we can do to save space, if I hold down Option on Mac or Alt on Windows and click on the mask, I can basically take this selection tool up here, the rectangular marquee tool, and I'll choose all this area that I don't need. All the black areas I'm not using. So with this selected, I'll go back to the layer and I'm just going to hit delete or backspace. And now you can see it takes out some of that, but we've gone from 1.52 gigs to 1.42. Let's do the same thing for this one here. I can hit Command or Control D to deselect. Let's go to this second mask. So Option or Alt click on the mask. This one's really tiny. I'll just choose this lasso tool, polygonal lasso tool. Select this little area. So this is the area I want to keep. and I want to get rid of all the black, so I need to choose everything outside of this area. I'll hold down Shift, Command I, and now I'm selecting all this black area. I'll go back to the layer, delete. So let's check down here. Now I'm at 1.22. Hold down Command or Control D to deselect, go to this one, and hit Option or Alt on the mask. Same thing as last time. I'll just select this area and then invert it. So Shift, Command I, go back to the layer, delete, and finally the last one. I'll again Alt or Option on the mask. I'll deselect, and then I'll choose this tool again, the rectangular one. This one I'll just go really fast and select everything here, go back to the image and delete that. So we've gone from 1.5 gigs and we just cut out more than 1/2 gigabyte of file size. So with all these layers, let's put these in a group so we can turn them off and on really seamlessly. So I'll click on the top layer, hold down Shift, and click on the bottom car trail layer, and then I can hit this thing here, which is going to put them in a folder or group. I can call this group car trails. And you can see if I turn this off and on that I'm basically just dropping in all the car trail stuff. Looks pretty good. So with that said, I think this is basically our base image. One thing that I really don't like about this photo are the distracting elements. There's not too many, but if we look in this bottom corner, there's a sign, and there's also a little piece of garbage or something like that. There's a lot of ways to get rid of objects in Photoshop, but let's look at a couple of them really fast. First, I'm just going to click on this button to add a new layer, a new blank layer. The first and easiest way to get rid of objects is to hit J on the keyboard, and that will choose your spot healing brush tool. I can hit Command plus to really zoom in, or Command minus to zoom out. Let's see if this tool works. So on this new layer, make sure you have Content Aware selected, and also checking Sample All Layers. I'm just going to drag over here, see if that works. That's not too bad, but it does leave a little bit of a weird transition. I can hit Command Z. Another option is to choose S on the keyboard, and that will give us the clone stamp. This is a little more complicated if you're new to this, but it's not too bad. I can choose Alt. Let's show a demonstration of this actually. If I hold down Alt, you can see I have a little target with crosshairs. This is the area that I'm going to be sampling from. So if I sample from this building up here, and then it will give me a brush tool. If I make this bigger, I can basically just start painting in that part of the building. So this at this point looks pretty horrible, so let's get rid of that. But let's see how we can actually use this in a realistic situation. So if I sample from maybe here, usually we choose an area that's very similar or nearby. I can line all these lines up, make sure I'm lining up the bricks as well, and just kind of paint that out. And that looks pretty good overall. This area, the line may have adjusted, so this is kind of up to you how in-depth you want to be. Depends what you plan to use the photo for, I think. I think that's a bit better. Now we kind of hide that line with some grass. So that's good for me. Let's add another layer on top of this, and we'll see how we can get rid of this little sign here. So to add basically I want to merge all the layers underneath this and create a new clean layer that we can work on. So to do that, I'll hold down Shift, Option, Command E. If you're on Windows, that will be Shift, Alt, Control E. And you can see I've got this new clean layer on the top. If I turn it off and on, nothing will happen because it's pretty much just a combination of all the layers underneath. I'm going to go back to this polygonal lasso tool, and I'm going to get really close here and try to select an area that doesn't include those top trails, something around here, and I'll close it off here. At this point I can just double click and it will close for me. If I hit Command or Control J, that will just add this new selected area onto a new layer. What I want to do here is hold down Command T, which will allow me to transform it. Let's zoom out a little bit. And then if I right click inside, I can choose warp. So object removal is, there's not only two ways to do it. Most people know the clone stamp and the spot healing brush, but there's a lot of interesting ways to go about doing this. It can get pretty creative and intense sometimes. But if I just start dragging these things around, since there's not much detail in this area, you'll never be able to tell that I am just extending these car trails and not doing anything to the road itself. So if we turn that off and on, I think that looks pretty good. We can now delete this layer underneath. We don't need it anymore. And we can choose this layer, hit Command or Control to select both of these. We'll put these in a folder as well. And I'll call this Object Removal. So in this case, it was pretty minor. Sometimes you have to remove a lot of stuff. If you want to get really into it, you can try and take out these cars as well, but I'm not really too bothered by them. So at this point, we've got a pretty good base image. Let's create a new clean layer on top once again, and we'll do some final adjustments to contrast and color. So again, I'll hit Shift, Option, Command E to create a new clean layer on top. Again, if you're on Windows, that's Shift, Alt, Control E. So we've got this, and usually after this I'll go to Filter and Camera Raw Filter and make some adjustments to the entire image that should start to pull it together a bit. Okay. So now that we're here, let's see what we can do. I think looking at the histogram, we might want to pull up the shadows a little bit. Looks fine actually. Let's leave it the way it was. I think some contrast could help, just a little bit. One thing that should make a pretty nice difference is dehaze though, especially in the sky. If I go crazy, this will start looking a little bit insane. But I think right now, just applying this to the sky looks pretty good. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with something pretty strong, maybe plus 20. I think that's the main thing I'm going to do. Maybe I want to pull back these highlights a little bit. I can tone down the whites slightly. I think I'll leave it for now. I can change the color temperature. At this point, I'm just kind of experimenting and seeing what I like and what I don't like. Maybe -5 is okay. I think I'll hit OK with that. So if we turn this off and on, you can see the before and after. One thing that I did in my original edit that I'm not going to do this time is I added a pretty serious gradient to the sky. I had to mask this out all manually by cutting out the sky. That can take some time, but you can see the difference between the sky here and there. That's something we can talk about on another day. I actually have a course that I put together, and I'll link that down below. So if you want to check out that, basically it will walk you through in a lot more detail than this. We start with really basic edits, and we work our way up to really complex stuff by the end of the course. But if you do want to check that out, I'll mention it again at the end, but it's an 8-hour course that should get you pretty comfortable with all this stuff by the end. But for now, that's going to take a very long time, so let's not do that. Let's see what else we can do. I'm going to copy this layer again. We could do the merge new layer thing, the Shift Option Command E, but I'm just going to hit Command J, which will copy this layer. So the other hotkey combination will copy everything underneath. Command J will just copy the top layer. I'll rename this one Camera Raw, or you can name it like Dehaze or whatever adjustments you made. It's just good to rename it something that allows you to remember what you did. So on this one, I'm going to right click and call it High Pass. In Photoshop, High Pass filter is basically a filter that's used for sharpening. So with the layer selected, we can click on Filter, Other, and High Pass. So basically you can see here, it's starting to really chisel out the details in the building and some other areas. Usually sharpening is something you want to add to buildings or something like that, but you don't want to apply it to water or sky or areas that are meant to be much softer. So in the building, I think this will look nice. This picture was shot on a Sony A7R3. So thank you again to Tech360 TV and to Alan Photo, who were the ones that hooked me up with the gear. Since the sensor size on that is quite big, I think we could probably get away with 3 pixels. If you're using an APS-C sensor, I'd probably do 2 pixels, or else this will start looking a little bit too sharp. Let's hit OK. So what is this? This just like looks like a giant gray mess. But what we need to do is change the blending mode to overlay. And if we really zoom in on this building now and turn this layer off and on, you can see how it starts to really chisel out some of the details there. I actually think it's doing a bit too much, so we could start all over and put in a lower pixel number, maybe use 2 pixels or something. Another option is just to lower the opacity here. And that maybe somewhere around, I think even more than that, maybe 60% or something. So now if we turn that off and on, it's not quite as strong. I might even make that 50%. So that's pretty good. So like I said, you don't really want to add sharpening to the sky or to places with water. No water in this picture. But with the sky, we want to pretty much eliminate it. Actually, I usually only add sharpening to the areas that I want to bring the focus or the reader's attention. So let's just add it only to the buildings. We could do this with some really complex version, but let's do it fast way for now, which is what I'm pretty sure I did in the original edit as well. So with the layer selected, hold down Option or Alt and click on the mask for a black mask, and then we'll choose a white brush and just paint it into the areas that we want. I can hit backslash again to turn on my quick mask mode, and then just paint it in here. These buildings off to the side, I don't think I really need it. They're more of a distraction, I think. So just doing this pretty quick, but it should be fine. Generally, you can get really intense and in-depth with the masking, but generally it's good to know lots of ways to mask so that you can choose the simplest version. I could do this another way that would probably take me 30 minutes, but I'd rather not do that right now, or possibly ever. So I think that looks pretty good overall. If we want to check the before and after from the very beginning, we have this base layer. I can hold down Option on Mac or Alt on Windows and click it. That will turn off everything else. So you can see we've started with this and we've gone to this. So it's a pretty big change. Let's see, is there anything else that I want to do? Yeah, let's do one last thing. So this is kind of an issue of personal preference. I'm going to add a new layer up on top by merging everything again. So just to remind you, that's Shift, Option, Command E, or Shift, Alt, Control E on Windows. So I've got this new clean layer. One thing that I like to do is add a little bit of vignette or a bit of a gradient just to bring the viewer's eye into the center of the picture. So I can do that again in Camera Raw. So let's first go to this FX panel. This is where vignette is located. If we drag this up, it will create a white vignette, which I don't ever use. If I drag it down, it will create a dark vignette around the outsides. It's best not to go too crazy or you'll get something like that. I usually don't go too much beyond 20. I think in this case 10 is pretty good, -10. I'm going to come back into the main panel here. I can choose this tool here, which is my graduated filter, and maybe I just want to lead the eye past these car trails into this building in the center. So I'll hold down Shift to make a straight line, click somewhere around here, and drag it to around here, I guess. And I already had settings put in, and I don't want to use them, so I'm going to click on this thing and hit Reset Local Correction Settings. But now I'm just going to bring back the exposure. It's also kind of like a vignette, but this will just lead the eye into the building. So I think -0.5 is pretty good. And I'll just hit OK. Alright, so I'm going to call this one vignette. And I think if we turn that off and on, you can see the difference. I think with that done, that I'm going to call it a day. There are some other things we could do to this photo, and if we were really getting in depth, I might try to pull out some of the texture in the clouds back here. There are some clouds that are hard to see. We can kind of pull them out and make it more dramatic. Like I showed you earlier, we could bring out the gradient in the sky a bit more just to give it a bit more of a dramatic effect as well. But I don't want to do too much in a simple edit like this. So I think we'll call it a day. Let's go back to the beginning though and go step by step through all the things that we've done. So we started out with Lightroom. This was the base image that we edited in Lightroom. Then we started bringing in the cars. Now, in my original image, I think I used 7 different layers. In this one, we've used 5. But it's a nice trick to have, especially for shooting car trails. You can kind of blend in multiple exposures and make it look like there's a lot more traffic than there actually was. I think it gives it much more impactful finished product. We did a little bit of object removal just in the corner here. So if we turn this layer off and on, you can see we've gotten rid of that garbage and also the sign. Zoom out a bit again. We made some base camera raw adjustments, mainly with dehaze and I think contrast or something like that as well. Then we did the high pass filter. It's hard to see on the screen, but if we really zoom in here and turn it off and on, you can see how it's affecting the details in the building. And then finally, you can hit Command 0 or Control 0 to go back to the full size image and turn this top layer on, and this is our vignette layer. So one last time, let's look at the before and after. It's made a pretty big difference overall, and I'm pretty satisfied with this. So I hope that was useful. Basically, this is a simple edit to edit car trails into a different a base photo. So again, in this picture, we took a blue hour base and then brought in the longer exposures for the car trails once it got darker. So it's good to plan out the way that you're shooting and really think about how you want to approach everything that you're doing. I talk about that a lot more in the article. So again, if you haven't read that already, go and check it out. I'll link that below. Thanks again to Tech360.tv, who have allowed me to use their studio and who have done some other things with me in the past. The article again is on their website. And also thank you to Alan Photo, who lent us the gear that we used to shoot this photo. So thanks again. If you have any questions, feel free to check the comments below. And I'll also include a link to everything that's relevant. That includes the article and the course. So thanks again, and see you another time.